in the Wartburg, where he was kept, protected under protective custody, so to speak. That's a good question for really the rest of the Reformation people. What did they do? Very simply, okay, it didn't take long. Once the 95 Theses were put out there, people started choosing sides pretty quickly. And people started siding with Luther quite strongly. And what did they do? Well, the obvious thing that they would do would be to continue their worship the way they had been doing, but remove certain teachings or certain practices away from their worship life. So, for example, we know that the princes of the areas, they kind of had control, and they would order people like Tetzel, the indulgence salesman, out of their territory. They would issue a statement, an edict, if you will, publish it, have the town crier, send it out saying, no more indulgences in this province, this duchy, or, whatever, dukedom or whatever, okay? But as far as everyday Sunday worship and, the preaching and whatever, that took a while to develop. When Luther was asked the same year he was excommunicated, he was asked, write us a worship service. And some of the people wanted something totally new and different than what they were used to, and he refused. The first service he wrote was one in Latin that was done for the university church there in Wittenberg, and for other churches where people would speak Latin, would know it well, and so on and so forth. And he called it his Mass, Luther's Mass, and it was not much different really than the Roman Mass, except for one big thing, and that was all of the thing that's referred to in the Roman Mass as the Canon. And the Canon is a particular time in the Mass where prayers are said, and all kinds of prayers. I mean, the canon of the Mass is, I guess you might say, the longest part or the biggest part of the Roman, what developed as the Roman Mass in the Middle Ages. In the Tridentine Mass, that is the Mass before Vatican II, and the one that you hear the Romans talking about a lot, the one that Pope says you can't do without my say-so, that one, it's a big part of that service. It's where names of sick people, names of the recently dead are spoken, prayers to various saints, especially a patron saint of the parish, for example, or a patron saint of the state or the country, or some profession, for example, would be mentioned or prayed to. There's usually a pretty good sized prayer in there to Mary, and things like that. And then again, people's names are mentioned and stuff like that. So the canon of the Mass, where prayers for the dead and prayers to saints and to Mary, whatever, takes up a pretty good chunk of a normal Roman Mass, even today in the Vatican II service. That's the biggest thing that changed. Luther took that totally out. And in its place, all he had was the Lord's Prayer and then the words of institution. And that's why in most Lutheran worship services, both Lutheran liturgies, you have the Lord's Prayer, and then immediately after, or fairly soon after, you have the words of institution or the consecration. It's because that was already in place in the Middle Ages and even in the very early Christian services. But what happened was that all kinds of other prayers got to be installed, if you will, around the Lord's Prayer. In other words, that's where that canon of the Mass developed. So when Luther took that out, all that was left was the Lord's Prayer. It took a while for the prayer of the church, what we have today, the prayer of the church, to get kind of put back. That took a while. There were a lot of people who were kind of afraid that it would start, that the prayer of the church will start accumulating, again, names and directed to various saints and stuff like that. And so there was a while there where the prayer of the church was almost gone. Now, we'll talk about that when we get to the Anglican part of worship, the worship section on Anglicanism. The Anglicans kept the canon of the Mass, just got rid of some of the objectionable elements, like, again, prayers to Mary and the saints. But they kept a lot of other things part of that. Lutherans, though, kept the rest of the service pretty much the same. And if you compare a typical Lutheran liturgy, let's say in the 1800s or 1700s, with the Roman service of the Middle Ages, you'll see that they line up pretty well. They line up almost directly, except again for that real long section in the middle, which is the canon of the Mass. So that took a while. When Luther did a service for the peasant people, for the non-Latin people, he used what we use on Christmas and Reformation, the German Mass, and it's much shorter than the Latin Mass, and has very few Roman elements in it. Okay? So he did a big change there for that. But that was because the peasants didn't understand the Roman service anyway, because it was done in Latin and they didn't speak Latin. So out in the hinterlands, you can imagine, it was pretty bad out there. You'd go to church, the ones when they went, and they didn't. Church attendance was really low before the Reformation in the hinterlands. You might have a pretty good crowd, where the Duke went to church, because everybody wanted to be seen by the Duke. They wanted to be, they wanted to maybe hit him up for a loan or whatever. Okay. Same in the university towns. The university towns like Wittenberg and Erfurt, they might have pretty good attendance because the students would all go and the professors would all go. But Luther tells us when he went out into Saxony, he went out into the countryside, he found that people didn't go to church much. And that's understandable, because they would go to church and they would hear nothing but Latin. And they didn't speak Latin. They weren't students. They weren't educated people. They were peasants, most of them. And even the professions, a mason or a blacksmith or those kind of guys, tradesmen, okay, they didn't speak Latin either for the most part. And so why go to church? You go to church and you just hear stuff that you don't really. Now, it's true that in the after the Lateran Council of 1215, there was a lot of education. Let's put it this way: there was some indoctrination that went on. In other words, to get people prepared for confession and Lord's Supper at 6, 8 years old, there was some indoctrination going on, and so they weren't really taught Latin, so to speak, but they were taught, or they were ordered, if you will, to memorize the Latin, so that when they heard the priest say a particular phrase in Latin, they knew to respond in Latin, okay, with their phrase that they memorized. All right. But Luther found that the peasantry, the children and the adults both, they didn't know the Ten Commandments. As a matter of fact, he found that a lot of the priests didn't know the Ten Commandments. They didn't know the Lord's Prayer in the vernacular. Okay, They had it memorized in Latin, but if he asked them, well, what does this mean? What do these words mean? Pater Noster, blah, blah, blah. What are they? I don't know. We were just told to memorize it, so we did. So they didn't know the Lord's Prayer. They didn't know the Apostles' Creed in their own language. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know really what it said. He found that, and that's one of the reasons that he did the catechism, the small catechism, and then later the large catechism, was to give the people something in their own language where they could learn some of these basic truths of Scripture. The same with worship. Again, they memorized the Gloria in Excelsis. They memorized the Gloria Patri. They memorized the Agnus Dei. They memorized these things. But if Luther would ask them, okay, what is that in German? What does that mean to you? We were just told to memorize them. There are certain points of the Mass where we know we're supposed to do those things. A priest says so and so, we respond with a phrase or a chant or whatever. So that took time. It took from, let's say, the time he was excommunicated, let's say it took years, really, for a different kind of church service, a different kind of worship, a different way of education. It took a while for those things to catch on. And in the meantime, you might say, yeah, it was pretty tough on people. You go to church, and the last Sunday that you were in church, there was a priest up there, and he was doing everything in Latin, and have the reading prayers to saints and Mary and everything. And then a week later, you go to church, and the canon is missing, and he's now speaking in German, and a lot of that stuff is missing. And the common person would say, "What the world's going on?" So. I don't think we have much of appreciation of what a earth-shattering experience that must have been for those people. To show up one Sunday and have things changed completely. And again, Luther was very cautious, and he told the other pastors who agreed with him, who wanted to do Reformation type service and things like that. Before the word Lutheran never was even invented. Okay, well, he told them. He said, "Take it easy. Take it easy on them. Don't try to do everything at once." So, for example, the people were used to getting just the bread, of course, for Lord's Supper. Now that had changed. Before 1215, they got just the wine. After 1215, they got just the bread. So that was a change. But 1215, 1517, that's 300 years. So for about 300 years, they were used to getting just the bread. And of course, people were only living about 50 years, and so that's 6 generations, all right? Grandma, great-grandma, great-great-great-great-great-grandma, okay? So when these people agreed with Luther, and they got rid of indulgences, and they got rid of purgatory, and they got rid of this and that, then Luther told them, he said, don't right away force them to receive the wine, because they're a little standoffish about it. They're, we were told that's not good for us, or whatever. We're not worthy, whatever. So he allowed people, or he suggested to people who agreed with him theologically, take it easy. The pastors out there say, take it easy. Now it got to a point a year or two in when people would ask him, okay, is it time now? And Luther said, yeah, it's time now. If you've had enough sermons where you've preached about the Lord's Supper, for example, and you have enough sermons where you've said, the true teaching is you should receive both, and you've done that. They didn't have Bible classes. They had hour-long sermons. They didn't have Bible classes. And so you've taught that enough times, and maybe in your visitation, they didn't do that much either. Luther encouraged them to start doing that, and they would finally do that. But in their visitation, teach people, hey, it's okay if you do this. It's okay now if you go this direction. Then after a while, Luther said, okay, it's time. Don't force anybody, obviously, but don't allow people to come and just receive one element anymore. Tell them if they're going to come, they don't have to come, but if they are going to come to Lord's Supper, tell them they're going to get both bread and wine from now on. Just tell them that. And you know, if they want to come, they'll come. If they don't want to come, okay, well, they won't come. But, you know, so again, this was again world changing. You know, this was earth shattering to these people. This was really something hard for them to grasp a lot of times. And again, I don't really think we really realize that. You know, to us who've been born and raised in Lutheran Church, or even if we came to the Lutheran Church later on in life, we're used to certain things, and we're used to seeing certain things and hearing certain things, and we kind of know what's normal and what's not. You know, it's kind of like you probably heard of people, you know, where you know, maybe they go on a vacation for a few months or whatever. Maybe they go for a whole summer, and they come back in the fall, and maybe there's a pastor who's decided to he's talked his council and his elders into going to contemporary worship, for example. And the church isn't big enough to have like two separate services. And so, you know, last time you were in church was, you know, early June, and everything was out of the hymnal, you know, the liturgy and whatever. And then you go off and visit people and go fishing and whatever. You come back a couple months later, and in September, and you come into church, and, you know, people have told me, you know, they come in, the altar's gone, you know, and the altar rail is gone, the pulpit's gone, the lectern's gone, pews are gone, chairs are in there instead, or sometimes not even chairs, other things. And there's a band set up over here, you know, and amplifiers all over the place. And, you know, you come in and you're looking for a bulletin or a worship folder, and there isn't one. But instead, they've got a big screen, you know, in the front of the church where the altar used to be, and there's pictures on there and words and stuff like that. And so you come in and you go, what's going on, you know? And the pastor comes out dressed maybe not even like this, no tie, maybe short pants and you know, some sandals or something, and maybe a big honking cross, you know, and he comes out, how's everybody this morning? Yeah, you're doing good. Yeah, good for you. Hallelujah. You know, yeah, let's have the band do a first number. Come on, guys, give the band a hand, you know. And, you know, the band plays some hallelujah gospel piece, you know, whatever, and people stand up and they're waving around, and, you know, you're sitting there, you're going, hey, you know, last time I was in church, it was, you know, pretty normal, and now this happened, right? Well, imagine that back in the Reformation time. Okay? It wasn't maybe that stark of a difference, but the theology was certainly different. The sermons were certainly different. You know, they would be encouraged to sing hymns, where before the choir was the only one that sung hymns. The people didn't sing. You know, so there were some pretty big changes. But it took time. Yeah, it really took time. And you know, by the time Luther died, everything was fairly, or I would say, settled. I guess. You know, the Lutheran service was practiced everywhere, pretty much. And so, and by that time they're turning out now seminarians, they're turning out new Lutheran pastors and stuff like that from the universities, and so by the time he died, you know, he died in 1546, so, you know, 1517, 1546, you know, if he lived one more year, it would have been 30 years of the Reformation. So after 30 years, I would say things were fairly settled, and they stayed that way until the 30 Years' War. 50 years down the road. And then during the 30 Years' War, of course, things were crazy because churches were burned to the ground and stuff like that. But that was a tough period. So, yeah, it was difficult. It was difficult. But it did take a while. Anything else? Let's do one passage. And this is a passage today is Galatians. Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5. I'll write it down so you can. Galatians 5, and we want to start at 16. Galatians 5:16. Paul, in his letters, often has what I like to refer to as his laundry lists. That is, he lists a bunch of things. Sometimes he lists spiritual gifts. Sometimes he lists positions in the church, pastor, teacher, evangelist, da-da-da. Sometimes he lists sins. Sometimes he lists positive traits of a Christian, let's say. Okay, so he does this every now and then in his letters. He will just string a whole bunch of words together of the same type of attitude or action or whatever, and just string them. This is one of the first. Galatians is a very early letter of Paul's, and one of the first letters of Paul, and he gives a list here in chapter 5. So let's look at the list, and I want to talk about the list just a little bit. Verse 16, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. Okay, so the first thing that Paul is doing, okay, he's going to be talking about two groups of things, spirit and flesh, okay, and then listing various things under these lists. He likes to do this. He likes to contrast spiritual truth and falsehood, heresies or false teachings, and so on and so forth. So here he's talking about life, living life for Jesus, living life for God, living life as a Christian, as opposed to living life for the world. Okay? Verse 17, the flesh, so he starts with the flesh, sets its desires against the Spirit. So, flesh against the Spirit, okay? So opposite the Spirit. And the Spirit against the flesh, okay? So there is conflict, okay? There is conflict. Spiritual things and fleshly things or worldly things. There is conflict. That's what he starts out with. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. Your new man wants to do things that are good. Your old man wants to do things that are bad, are sinful. Okay? So Paul starts out by saying, you as a believer are going to want to do good stuff, but you're not going to be able to always. Okay? If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. So for your new man, there doesn't need to be a law. You don't need to make rules against things for your new man. Your new man will only choose those things which are pleasing to God. Okay. Now, the deeds of the flesh. Okay, now he comes with the list. They are evident. They are immorality. The Greek word there basically is referring especially to sexual immorality, okay, and especially adultery. Okay, so when Paul uses the term immorality in our English versions, I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but 90% of the time he's talking about adultery, and I would say 50% of the time he's talking about prostitution. Prostitution has always been a problem in the world, and in the Christian church, prostitution has always been there. There are some periods in the church where it's been more evident than others, but in the beginning it was certainly there, because prostitution was something that was considered to be kind of a run-of-the-mill operation. In other words, prostitutes were looked upon as a necessary part of society. You had to have prostitution, otherwise societies were afraid that there would be a lot of violent rape and a lot more affairs, let's call them, okay? So it was considered, if you were a Roman man, for example, if you were a Roman husband, if you're a Roman husband or a Greek husband, it was considered normal for you to make use of a prostitute, and that was considered better than to have an affair with another a married woman, okay, or even unmarried woman, okay. Especially in Rome. Rome really looked down their nose at people who had affairs. They didn't like that. But there again, prostitution was considered necessary so that there wouldn't be more of that. Okay, so immorality, sexual immorality in the Christian church was a real problem, much bigger than in just about any time of the church, except maybe our own modern era, say maybe since the sexual revolution of the 60s, I would say. So it was a real problem. Impurity. Impurity is very often linked with different kinds of sexual practices. And same as sensuality, the next word. Okay, sensuality is kind of like indulging the senses, whereas impurity is drunkenness. Okay. Impurity would be licentiousness or lust, that kind of thing. Maybe not carried out all the way to fulfillment, okay, but it was certainly there. So impurity is more of a mind thing. The immorality is more of a physical thing, okay, and then the sensuality also is mind, but then it's carried out. Being glutton, for example. Overindulging in anything, no matter what it is. It could be overindulging in sports. It could be overindulging in drink. It could be overindulging in food, and so on and so forth. And then idolatry, of course, worshiping false gods. And there were all kinds of ways that this was done in the old days. And sorcery, witchcraft. Okay, enmities. Enmities is I guess the best term for that might be something along the lines of bigotry. Okay, being against people simply for the work that they did, or for the color of their skin, or from their nationality, or something like that. Strife is somebody who's always arguing. Jealousy is just what that is. Jealousy being jealous or lustful for something that somebody else has. Outbursts of anger, having a bad temper. Disputes. And again, these are disputes over minor things. Right? You're just a crabby person. Okay, you're a person who just likes to fight about stuff. Okay, dissensions, that is dividing, let's say, families, dividing couples, spouses, dividing brothers and sisters, that kind of thing. Factions, that's society, dividing society. I'm an Epicurean. Okay, I like to indulge my senses. This guy, I'm a Stoic. I like to just sit and contemplate, the universe or whatever. And if I'm a Stoic and you're an Epicurean, I hate you. Okay, or we don't want any Epicureans in our city council, for example, or we don't want no Stoics in our city council or our school board or whatever. Okay, so factions, creating factions, envying, again, like jealousy, maybe a little less. Maybe, but still there. Drunkenness, obviously, overindulging in alcohol particularly. Carousing, that's going from place to place, doing nothing but party. You just go from one party to the next party. You're not doing anything productive, all right? And things like these, of which I forewarned you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, notice he doesn't say those who do such things. He says those who practice such things. Okay? In other words, the point is, you do these things, you don't have any repentant thought. You don't have any sorrowful thought or contrite thought. You do them, you enjoy them, you keep doing them. You have no intention of stopping doing them. So it's not the actions themselves that are damnable, it's the fact that you are unrepentant, and being unrepentant, that means you're an unbeliever, all right? And then he goes on here, but the fruit of the Spirit, and you'll notice that the list is not as long, is it? The fruit of the Spirit is love, and that's agape love, okay? That's the kind of love, the sacrificial kind of love, okay? And then joy, that's being in joy of our world and what God has given us. Peace, be at peace with people, not being part of factions and so on and so forth. Patience, being patient with people and not getting angry with them. Kindness is just that, kindness, to be kind to somebody. And goodness is to be good about everything. Faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Okay, against these things there is no law. So notice these things are a little broader. Would you say they're a little broader? They're a little more. They're all positive, of course, but they're not quite as specific as the list of bad things. Huh? And this you'll find very common in Paul's lists. When he lists sins, he's pretty specific, and when he lists good attributes, he's fairly general. And again, this goes back to something he said. There's you don't make rules for your new man. Okay, against such things there's no law. Well, we would say, well, yeah, of course. Okay, why would you make a law against love? Why would you make a law against joy? All right, but this is the point, that you don't make rules and regulations for your new man. Your new man doesn't need them. Okay. That doesn't mean he doesn't need to be educated. He doesn't need guidance. He doesn't need to be taught certain things in Scripture. That's not the point. The point is that the motivation is already there. Your new man wants to do good and wants to serve God. And Paul then gives just some general guidelines, if you will, or some general descriptions of how to go about that. All right? And then now those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. So the point is that believers, we do not and should not be slaves to the flesh. Right? That's the point. And I was talking to a member about this the other day. It is still true that too often Christians leave church on a Sunday and don't take God with them. In other words, the old saying, is there enough evidence to convict you of being a believer on Thursday? You know, or if I went to your next door neighbor and said, hey, I'm so and so's pastor, that lives next door to you, would the neighbor be shocked? What? He's a Christian? He goes to church? Wow, boy, sure doesn't act like it. Okay. This is a real problem. Okay, this is a huge problem. It always has been. I mean, there's always been a difficulty with that. But I think today, and maybe the last, 40, 50 years, it's more of an issue, more of a problem than in the past. Okay. All right. So much for Galatians chapter 5. Questions, comments? Let's move on then to the Anglicans. Now, I have a little comment on the board about Anglicans and about this Bible study, or this study. Don't try not to fall asleep. And that's because Anglicans, Episcopalians are referred to in Christianity very often as the frozen chosen. They are incredibly boring, okay? Sometimes people refer to them as kneelers, okay, because they continue to kneel in the Protestant church, as opposed to most Protestants who don't, and so on and so forth. So the Episcopalians or Anglicans are thought of in Christianity as being just about the most laid back, the most eccentric maybe, the most philosophical, the most deep thinking, and just kind of boring, lazy people. Very much opposite Baptists who are rabble-rousers, or Methodists who are trying to do lots of good deeds, or Presbyterians who are sometimes just about as boring as Anglicans. So, Anglicans, the frozen chosen. Yes, sir. Didn't I just hand you them? Oh, you picked up the wrong ones.
This is Lutheranism.
No, we're done with Lutheranism.
I know, but that's what I said.
Oh, okay. See, you stole the wrong ones.
I didn't steal any.
Okay, so the frozen chosen. Let's talk about the frozen chosen. Anglicans. All right. The word Anglican refers to the teachings and rites of Christians in communion, or fellowship, if you will, with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right? So that's the center point of Anglicanism. As Rome is the center point of Romanism, Canterbury in England, southern England, down there by the White Cliffs of Dover, is the center point of Anglicanism. Thus it is used to refer to those churches of a unique religious and theological tradition apart from Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant. Okay? So are the Anglicans Protestant? Yeah, they are, but they're unique. They're, I would say, halfway in between Romans and, let's say, Lutherans, for example. The word Anglican originates in Ecclesia Anglicana, okay? The medieval Latin phrase dating to at least 1246, meaning the English church. Angles are Ingles, English. Now, where did the Angles come from? Well, the Angles came from northern Germany, right around where Denmark is. That's where the Angles came from. The Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, came from a little further south and a little bit to the east. So if you're looking at a map of Europe and you see Denmark sticking up into the North Sea, all right, you go down that neck, okay, there is the little province of Schleswig-Holstein, all right, that in Germany, that's kind of where the Angles are from. And then go down a little further and towards Poland, and that's where the Saxons are from, okay? If you go a little further to the east, you get Prussians, and then Poles, okay? So the Saxons are there, and the Saxons kind of drift down the rivers of Germany or towards the Alps in a way there. So Luther, for example, would be considered a Saxon, all right? Well, way back when, we're talking now, we're talking 900s, 800s, 700s, 800s, 900s, the Angles and Saxons in various invasions came over from Denmark along with the Danes and invaded England, mostly on the east side of England, okay? And they captured a lot of that country and ruled that country for a long time. And eventually they intermarried with the native Britons, right? And the Britons and the Angles and the Danes and the Saxons and other Germanic type tribes all blended together to become the Anglo-Saxons or the English. Okay, English. So for example, WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, okay, WASP. That's where they originate, right there in medieval England. England started out with Britons and Celts and Picts, P-I-C-T-S, Picts. These were not Germanic. They were not Norse. They were Celtic. They were their own group. All right, they got overrun by the Norse at various times and by the Swedes, the Danes, the Saxons, the Angles. And so what you have when you get to given to the ceremony known as the Eucharist, also called Holy Communion or Mass. They prefer the term Eucharist. You will see that used in Episcopal materials and Anglican materials more often than you'll see communion or Mass, even though it's the exact same thing. But they just, it's like anything else. Certain words become more used in various groups. It's like Lutherans don't tend to use the term Mass. There's nothing wrong with using the term Mass. The term Mass is used throughout the Lutheran confessions. And when Luther wrote his worship services, he called them Masses. Okay? So there's no reason why Lutherans shouldn't use the term Mass. But boy, howdy, you use that term usually among Lutherans, and oh man, they get all excited. Oh, you're Roman. No. It's an old term. It goes way back before there was a real distinctive Roman church. The celebration is central to worship for Anglicans. That means they have it every time they worship. Every Sunday, their worship service is like a Roman service in that way, and like our service here. Every Sunday, an Anglican would not think, cannot imagine a worship service, especially a Sunday worship service, without the Lord's Supper. It would just be like, that's like half a service. It's like something's wrong here, right? And Lutherans, by the way, used to think that way back when. Lutherans?
How come they changed it from every service to have communion to not?
Weren't you here when I explained that? Okay. Short version. The churches that began the American Lutheran Church, if you go to Lutheran Church in Europe, there's communion every Sunday. Okay? Yeah. If you go to church in Germany, the Lutheran Church in Germany, there's communion every Sunday. Doesn't matter how liberal they are or conservative. They have church every Sunday, or Lord's Supper every Sunday. But at the time that the American Lutheran churches were formed, the congregations were formed, there was a movement going on in Germany called Pietism. And Pietism played down the sacraments. The sacraments were not important. What was more important is feeling, okay? And good works and stuff, piety. Acting pious was more important than sacraments, okay? So that's what happened. And since most American congregations were formed during that period of time when the sacraments were played down, that's just the tradition that evolved in the United States. The celebration is central to worship, a communal life of offering and prayer, praise, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, recalled through prayer, reading of the Bible, singing, and sharing of bread and wine, initiated by Jesus Christ's Last Supper. So again, their liturgy is patterned along the same lines as ours and the Romans. Goes back to if you take the Lutheran liturgy, the Roman liturgy, the Anglican liturgy, and take them all and follow them in history, okay, they'll all come to a central point where they started from. Okay, and that central point was in the very early church, I'd say by 350, 400, no later than 450. By that time, the Christian church around the world had the same liturgy, had the same worship. Okay, and it stayed that way, basically. Well, it stayed that way until the 30 Years' War and Pietism. Anglicans celebrate the Mass in ways similar to the Roman tradition, yet do not recognize a single authority such as the Pope of Rome. Anglicanism is a liturgical church, and worship styles vary from simple to elaborate or even a combination, usually a combination. Anglicans are a motley group, just as English are a motley group. And you can find very high church Anglicans and very low church Anglicans. And it just kind of depends. Episcopalians in the United States are kind of middle of the road. Kind of right in the middle. But you can find higher ones and lower ones too, if you look. Unique to Anglicanism is the Book of Common Prayer, the collection of worship services that all worshipers in the Anglican Church follow. The first Book of Common Prayer was compiled in English by Thomas Cranmer in the 16th century. This was right around the time of King Henry VIII. Okay? King Henry VIII was a contemporary of Martin Luther. He started the Anglican Church, and Thomas Cranmer was especially an important person during the very brief reign of Henry's son, Edward VI. And had Edward VI lived, it is very likely that Anglicanism would have developed completely different and become very much like Lutheranism, much more like Lutheranism. Yeah.
Contemporary is like a student, a learner of someone. When you
A
say
what?
somebody is a contemporary of someone,
No, lived at the same time.
lived at the same time.
Lived at the same time. That's what that means. Yeah. Contemporary. Yeah. Contemporary of somebody is somebody who lives at the same time. So so for example, Henry VIII, when Luther put out the 95 Theses and then started to talk against certain other Roman teachings, Henry wrote Henry, very, very intelligent man, very learned man, and he wrote a book. And the book was called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Because by that time, by 1522, 23, Luther decided, well, there's only 3 sacraments. There's not 7. And he wrote books on that, or pamphlets on that. And Henry got one and took umbrage on it, was offended by it. And so he wrote his own book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. And that is why Henry VIII was given a medal by the Pope and declared defender of the faith. When you hear Elizabeth II, the old lady that she is, when you hear Elizabeth II referred to as defender of the faith, that is why. Because her ancestor, Henry VIII, was the first to get that title. And so that title has gone down in time, in history, from one to the other, from king to king, to queen, to queen, to king, to queen, all the way down, all the way from Henry VIII to modern times. And when she dies and Chuck takes over, or Willie, whichever, and he's enthroned, and crowned, and big ceremony, all right, you will hear, if you watch it on TV, you will hear him declared defender of the faith. That's why. That's where that comes from. It comes from Henry. Okay. Now, of course, he and the Pope didn't see eye to eye later on, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Modeled on Roman Catholic missiles. Those are not rockets. Okay? You still have them today. If you go over to St. Andrews or over here to Queen of the Mountains or whatever it's called, you will find the weekly missal. And the weekly missal is a little booklet, okay, kind of like our bulletin, but a lot thicker. And sometimes in certain parishes around the country, sometimes they do it only monthly. Depends on their money, it depends on how much they have. But they do it monthly or weekly, and in there you have the service for the Sunday, and you have other services. There'll be masses, let's say, during the week, and they will be listed in there, and the readings will be listed so that you can read them ahead of time or follow along. Their hymns will be listed. That's hymn selections, okay? So it's kind of like, I guess the missal would be kind of like a miniature hymnal, okay? A paper hymnal, about the size of our meditations, maybe a little bit bigger, but about that size. And this is produced, as I say, in many parishes, this is produced every week. Some parishes, only once a month, but a lot of times. So if you ever want to know what's going on in a local Roman parish, all you have to do is go by and pick up a missal, okay, the Sunday missal. So a missal is simply like a missive, a writing, a scribe, okay, a missive, okay, that contains all the prayers, all the readings, all the hymns, and everything for worship for that day or week or month. That's all it means. And so the missals were already around in the Middle Ages. And what Thomas Cranmer did is he took one and he said, we can do this on a year's basis. We don't have to produce this every week or every month. We can do it for a whole year. And so that's what he did. He sat down and he did a missal basically for the whole year. All the prayers for every day of the year, by the way, not just Sundays, but every day of the year. Okay, if you wanted to have a worship service, every 365 of them, you could do that with the Book of Common Prayer. Still can. Okay, so all the prayers were unique. All the prayers were different. All the collects, okay, were different. All the introits were different. All the graduals were different. The readings were all different, and so on and so on and so forth. Okay, so the entire church year, just like I plan out the entire church year every year, Thomas Cranmer did it once and we are supposed to use that 1 year's worth of stuff till eternity. Okay? And so if you go online, for example, and you go to Book of Common Prayer, okay, you can usually find two of them. You can find, well, maybe sometimes more than that. You can find the old one, the original, and then you can find the modern one, okay? And that will give you a list of lessons and prayers and everything. I mean, I tell people all the time, you want a reading plan? Let's say you want to read through the Bible in a year. Go to the Book of Common Prayer. It's got a bunch, okay? It's got a bunch. There are obviously many others nowadays on the internet, but that's what Thomas did. He took 365 days and he arranged it religiously, all right? The church year, going by the historic church year, same as the Romans have, same as we have. Okay? Anglicans traditionally date the origins of their church to the arrival in the kingdom of Kent of the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Kent is kind of southwest, southwest. I don't think it goes all the way to Land's End, but it's right around in there. St. Augustine, not the same Augustine of Hippo. You know, we talk about St. Augustine and like Martin Luther was an Augustinian. This is a different St. Augustine, okay? Theologian and church father at the end of the 6th century. So right around 500, okay? Now, Patrick, understand this. St. Patrick, all right? He was in 400s, early to middle 400s. And Patrick was a Christian, but he was a Celtic Christian. In other words, before the Romans got to England as far as their church is concerned, Christians were in England very early, 1st century. In the 1st century, we know there were Christians in England, right? But those Christians this was before there was a Roman church. And so the Christians in England developed their own church. It was the Celtic church, full of, Britons and the Irish and the Scots, the Picts, okay, and the Welsh. These are all Celtic tribes, all right? And so they developed their own church, right? Okay. So Augustine comes after that. The Pope decided, hey, there's a whole bunch of Christians up there in the British Isles, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. I want them. I want them under my umbrella. And so he sent Augustine, go convert those boogers from Celtic Christians to Roman Christians. What's the difference? There ain't any difference. Well, there wasn't any difference. Except, again, their practices were a little bit different. Okay. Paragraph 5, my friend. The origins of the church in the British Isles extend much further back in time, as I was just saying. Christianity first gained a foothold during the Roman occupation of Britannia as early as the 1st century. The first recorded Christian martyr in Britain, St. Alban, is thought to have lived in the early 4th century, so the early 300s. And his prominence in Anglican history is reflected in a number of parish churches of which he is patron. There are probably more St. Albans churches in England than any other name. Just about every little village you go to, every little hamlet you go to, there's a St. Albans. Everywhere. There's St. Albans all over the place. Okay? A Christian named Restitutus is known to have been the Bishop of London, and he is named as having attended the Council of Arles down in France. Irish Anglicans also trace their origins back to the founding saint of Irish Christianity, St. Patrick, who was a Roman Briton and predated Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Okay, so we think Patrick was a Pict. Okay, he was a Celt, he was a Pict, and his father was a Patricius. That is, he was a Roman magistrate. The Romans had conquered Britain by that time, and the native people were pretty much amalgamated into the Roman Empire. And Patrick's father was a judge, a magistrate, justice of the peace, whatever you want to call him, in the far western part of Northumbria, okay, just below Hadrian's Wall, or just below the dividing line from Scotland and England. Okay, is that Inverness? I think is Inverness around there someplace. So it's just south of Inverness is where Patrick lived and where his father was a Roman judge. He was kidnapped by Irish raiders, many of which were pagan at that time. They hadn't been brought into the church. And they were Norse. They were a combination of Norse and Celtic Irish. And they were not real well behaved. They were kind of barbaric. And one of the things, one way to make money in those days was to row across the sea there, the Irish Sea between Ireland and England, and raid the farms and ranches and stuff and whatever, and villages along the coast. And so they would go in there and they would capture people and they'd hold them for ransom. That was the big thing to do. And being the son of a magistrate, being the son of probably the second most important guy in the whole area, maybe mayor or something would be more important, but he was very important. Patricius was an extremely important guy, and so his son, and they think his name was probably something along the lines of Scotus or something Latinized. His name was not Patrick as all. He was called Patrick later on in life because of his father's position, Patricius, right? So in any case, he was kidnapped and taken over to Ireland and was going to be held for ransom. But I guess his father refused to pay or refused to deal with them, or said, if you show up here asking for money, I'll chop your head off. And so they decided to sell him into slavery to an Irish chieftain, and the Irish chieftain put him in charge of his flock of sheep out in the boonies. And Patrick learned how to rough it. He was a spoiled rotten brat when he was back in England, Inverness. He was a spoiled rotten brat. And everybody talks about how this guy, this kid, Scotty or whatever his name was, would go around town, and pulling people's pigtails and tying cans on the tails of dogs and, this kind of stuff. And he was just a really rotten kid. Well, anyway, so he gets sold into slavery, and he goes and he has to live out in and there are not a lot of trees in Ireland, especially back in those days. And so the pastures, just rocks pretty much. And so he's got nowhere to protect himself from the rain. And he talks about this in his autobiography he wrote. He talks about living with a tiny little leather wrap. That's it. That's all he had. And fighting off wolves with his bare hands, and digging grubs and eating those because he had no food, and drinking out of a stream and all this kind of stuff. And so he toughed up real good. He became a outdoorsy kid, all right? And he learned humility. And so God kind of chose him that way, and took him away from his pampered beginning and toughed him up in the pasture lands of Ireland. And then he escaped. And he got in a boat with some pig farmers and landed on the shores of France in Brittany. And there he met a priest, and he started learning for the priesthood. And after he learned all of the things you need to know to be a priest, he received a vision from God, and it was a vision of an Irishman saying, "Please come back to us." Now, he wasn't Irish. He was Scottish, or he was Pictish. But the vision was of an Irish person, come back to Ireland. And so he did. He got on a boat, and he went back to Ireland, and he went back to the same guy who was a slave owner. It was his owner, and he eventually converted him to Christianity. And then he converted the whole rest of the island. So the Anglicans like to take Patrick as their own, and of course this causes no end of consternation in the island of Ireland, because of course the Roman Church took over Ireland much later on, way down the road, but they took it over. And so the Romans like to think of Patrick as theirs. And the Anglicans, the Church of Ireland, likes to think of Patrick as theirs. And so on St. Patty's Day, that's why the orange and the green fight so much. Because they're fighting over who was Patrick. Was Patrick our patron saint, or is Patrick your patron saint? Well, they like to say Patrick is, of course, the patron saint of all Irishmen. Well, but you'll get an argument if you get a Northern Irishman and a Southern Irishman, an Orangeman and a Greenman. Okay? The green means the green is for Catholicism or Romanism, and the orange is for Protestantism or the Anglican Church. Okay, and so me father, he was orange, and me mother, she was green. Right? Okay, the great Irish Rovers song. Right? You should listen to that sometime. It's a very cute song. Anyway. So that's the story of there. Patrick, who was a Roman Briton, so some Anglicans considered Celtic Christianity the forerunner of their church. Since the reestablishment of Christianity in some areas in the early 6th century came via Irish and Scottish missionaries, Patrick and St. Columba. St. Columba is the patron saint of Scotland. Okay? All right. We will talk about the English Reformation next time. Next page, paragraph 6. So I hope nobody's asleep. We don't get into the sleepy stuff until way down the road. So. All right, let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us all. Amen.